All right, so range in Python is a built-in function in Python that's used to generate a sequence of numbers over time. And when we say over time, we could also just as accurately say on the fly or as needed. And we'll circle back around to that. So it's widely used in for loops, and it's used to iterate over a sequence of numbers. And then there's three different forms of range, but really what this means is that there's three different ways to call it, aka calling it with one argument, calling it with two arguments, and calling it with three arguments. So let's take a look at this first example where there's one argument and understand how it works, and also understand what this over time or on the fly means. So for I in range of 5, in a for loop in Python, the variable after the for keyword, which is I, takes on each successive value from the sequence that follows the in keyword. And that sequence is given to us by range of 5. So we pass in one argument of 5, and Python's going to see one argument and it's going to say, okay, they're calling range with one argument, so that argument is going to be stop, a stop argument. And we're going to generate a sequence of numbers from 0 to stop -1. So Python's going to go ahead and generate that sequence of numbers from 0 to 5 minus 1. And that is 0 through 4. So as we go through each iteration of the for loop, and let's do that now, we iterate. So I starts as 0, and then we print that to the console, and we iterate through. I becomes 1, it's printed out. I becomes 2, printed out. I becomes 3, that gets printed, and then I is 4, and that gets printed as well. Now, we might think just naturally that range returns some sort of array or some sort of list of numbers from 0 to 4, and that gets created, and then we loop through the array. We look at each element in the array as we loop through, and we assign each element to I as we iterate through the for loop. But that's not what range does, and there's a good reason for that. Imagine a case where range was really high, and let's take a look down here at this example where that is the case. So we pass in a stop argument to range. We pass in one argument, so it's a stop argument, and this is a range of 1 billion numbers, right? So imagine if Python created an array from 0 to 999,999,999, right? All the way to, that number, which I won't type out all the way, but imagine that it creates this very, very large array. That is not memory efficient. So that's going to take up a lot of memory. And if you're using such a case in an application, it might actually even make the application crash. So what range does is it doesn't create an array. Instead, it just gives us the number at that particular iteration of a for loop. So we can X out this array because that's not what it does. What it does is for the first iteration of the for loop, it just gives us 0. And then in the second iteration of the for loop, it just gives us 1. And so on and so forth. And the reason why in this particular case it's so effective is because we are breaking out of the for loop after I is greater than 10. So imagine we created this whole big array, and then 99% of the array was never even used. And so it was created and it used all this memory for no reason. So that's the brilliance of range. That's the beauty of range. It only ever really needs to, hypothetically, it can take up just one just one number at any given point in memory, just one number. Now it may, depending on the Python interpreter's implementation details, it may take instead of just one number, it might take up a couple, but it'll never take up the same amount as the entire array, especially in a case like this where we have a billion numbers. So that's the beauty of range. So, and that's what it means when we say range is a function in Python that generates a sequence of numbers over time. It generates it on the fly. It generates it as needed for that specific iteration of the for loop. So now that we've gone over this first example over here, and we've checked out what range really gives us, and how range gives us a sequence of numbers, gives us one by one. Now let's go through the other two examples. So what if we pass in two arguments into range? Here we've got 5 and 10. Well, if Python sees that we passed in two arguments, Python will go, okay, they passed in two arguments. Whenever you pass in two arguments into range, the first argument is start and the second argument is stop. And start will be the first number in the sequence that range gives us on each iteration. And then stop will still be the same as up here. It'll be stop -1. So on the first iteration, we'll get 5 and print I will print 5. And we'll do the same, print 6, iterate again, print 7, iterate again, print 8, iterate again, print 9. And since this 10 is exclusive, meaning we only go one below it, we stop at 9. So as you can see with these first two examples, we're naturally incrementing by 1. 0 is going to 1, 1 is going to 2, 2 is going to 3. And then on the second, 5 is going to 6, 6 is going to 7, 7 is going to 8. So we're incrementing naturally. The increment is being defaulted to 1. And that's where this third argument can make a change. It can make we can customly and directly set the increment to whatever we want with the third argument. So when we pass in 3 arguments, Python sees that and it says, okay, they pass in 3 arguments, which means the first one, whenever you pass in 3 arguments, the first one is going to be the start, the second is going to be the stop, and the third is going to be the step or the increment argument. But we refer to it usually as step. So we're going to start at 0. I is going to be set at 0, and then we're going to print I. I gets printed, and it's 0. And then we increment by 2, not by 1 like we usually do. We increment by 2. So now I get set to the next number in this sequence, which is 2. And we print that out. And then again, we iterate on the for loop. Range will give us just the next number in the sequence, which is 4. And when I say just the next number, I mean the next number in the sequence, keeping in mind the iteration or the step of that particular range, of that particular sequence. And we continue to do so. We continue to iterate and then print out I until we get to 8. And while we have 10 here, and you'd think, well, the stop is 9, since the stop lets us know, hey, we're going to stop the sequence at 10 minus 1, because we're incrementing by 2 and 9, even though it's less than 10, it does not match our incremental pattern, and therefore we do not include it in the sequence. So that is range in Python. It's a built-in function that's used to generate a sequence of numbers over time or on the fly, and it's often very commonly used in for loops to iterate over a sequence of numbers. So for each iteration of the for loop, range will give us just the number of the sequence at that point. That's the on the fly or the over time part. And range has three different forms or three different ways of being called. The first is with one argument, where Python will say, okay, there's just one argument, so that's our stop argument, and it'll generate a sequence of numbers from 0 to stop -1. If we pass in two arguments to range, Python will say, okay, we've got a start argument and a stop argument, and it'll generate a sequence of numbers from start to stop -1. And then lastly, if we pass in three arguments into the range function, Python will say there's three arguments. The first one is start, the second one is stop, and the third one is step. And it'll generate a sequence of numbers from start to stop -1 and increment the sequence of those numbers by step. And just as a final thought, range only accepts integer values as its arguments. So for all three, for stop, for start, and for step, only integer arguments are accepted by range.